Hi everyone, Jay here from Jade Productions, back with another video. Today we'll be breaking down a competitive Daughters of Cain army list, and we'll be looking at what it does, how it's supposed to do it, its competitiveness, and things you can do to improve on this list as an example, as well as talking, in general, counters, counterplays, how to use it. Now, the most important thing about this list is that it's based on the idea of pure aggression, and the idea behind it is essentially an elven cavalry force without any cavalry, focusing on powerful cycle charges, and getting that first strike, first kill. Now, to go with that, we've gone with the temple with Driachi Ganeth, which is a powerful temple. It has the ability to, when your Daughters of Cain units charge, on the turn they charge, they get +1 to hit. This is fantastic, because it means that your many already accurate attacks are now becoming even more accurate, hitting on 2s, which is fantastic. And the way that this army is laid out is it's designed to take advantage of this temple trait as much as possible, or as much as you physically, reliably need to in a battle. So, starting first off, the very first important thing about this list is that it is 4 drops. In being 4 drops, in that it is 3 characters and everything else is in 1 battalion, you're able to drop it down quickly, and very few people will drop before you, giving you good control over who has that first turn, which is super important for an aggressive army like yours. For example, if you're facing an equally aggressive army, such as Flesh Eater Courts, or a steamrolling army, such as the Beastclaw Raiders and Ogre Moor tribes, who will attempt to steamroll through you, and your aggression will either be squashed or you'll break through, it's better to set yourself back and decide to let them move forward so that you can make the most of your aggression. At the same time, you might encounter other armies that are shooting armies that might decide, or other armies that are just not quite as aggressive and not quite as mobile, that might decide to deploy back in their deployment zone. In which case, you're left with a good choice of you can force them to approach, which, in all seriousness, if you are faced in such a dilemma as the player who is facing a very aggressive list such as this for Daughters of Cain, your first turn should literally be, unless you're trying to grab objectives, not moving at all and making them come to you. Because you are extremely fast as the Daughters of Cain. You can get across the field, across the no man's land, very quickly, and potentially get those first turn charges. It's a thing that's definitely possible, especially based on how your opponent deploys. So when it comes to that deployment and those drops and picking who goes first, you have the choice of forcing them to come towards you, which is something that no one wants to do, or you can force yourself into a position of a first turn charge, and you can get aggressive, and that will force them to respond. So there's some mind games you can do just on deployment, so you've got a good chance of deploying first, which is excellent for this kind of army, which is that hyper-aggressiveness. Now, when we look at the army in detail, you'll notice that we have 4 leaders, 3 of which are not in the battalion. So our first leader is Morathi, the High Oracle of Cain, 480 points. Now, Morathi is an interesting choice. She's one of those choices that you include in your army, and during her first turn or 2, depending on the circumstances you're going for, she's an excellent magic engine for getting off a spell. In this case, we've gone with Mind Razor. Mind Razor being an excellent spell that will give us rend on potentially our Death Star Blob, in this case for this list of Witch Elves, which we'll talk about later. And it will allow you to set your units up so that they get the extra rend, so that they'll be able to pick through with their copious number of attacks. The things with 3-ups and 4-up saves much more reliably. You're not just going to be relying on sheer weight of attacks, you'll actually be able to mitigate the amount that they'll stop. And the more attacks they get through, the better it is for you, because that is the one thing you excel at, a lot of attacks and burying them in saves. And so You don't need it when you're fighting things with 5-up saves. You'll chew through them like no problem. If you want to be especially mean and ensure that they're dead, and make them go up to a 6-up save or a 6-up to a nothing save, well then that's very cruel, but you're also playing Daughters of Cain, you're here for the cruelty. You're exceptionally good at tearing through light hordes already, just with your sheer number of attacks, but you can make it that much better, just to ensure that whatever it is you're hitting is not going to have any chance of making any sort of saves to try and hold on. But it is very important to take it for that anti-armor aspect, and we're using Morathi to deliver it here in this list. The rest of her spells are okay, and she can cast a lot. She's got her Supreme Sorcerer, her Sorcerer Supreme, for just that slight more reliability, which we want since Mind Razor is a 7 to cast. And to be honest, she's not going to be doing much in her standard form before really she's not going to be doing much at all. Her main goal is to simply cast and provide some magic support. She might throw out the Mystic Shield and an Arcane Bolt. But the Mind Razor is the most important one, and in addition, the Mind Razor, if we can get it to go successfully, if you cast it and you send your units into the right unit, you'll also be getting extra damage, which will, again, increase your damage output and make it easier to hack through those larger targets. For example, because how it works is that if your unit that you've got it cast on is fighting something with a lower bravery, unmodified, then you get your damage increased by 1 for their attacks in addition to the -1 rend. So this is really good if you can get it to go off. Most of your bravery is pretty average at around 7. It's 9 on some of your characters, but 7 is pretty decent. Anything bravery 6 or below, which is most real chaff units that are mostly used for screening, you're going to tear through pretty well. But most other things will be 7 or 8, and against death armies this will just have no effect, unfortunately. But in that case, you have the sheer number of attacks, and in the case of Ossiarchs, you desperately need that rend, especially if they're going for Petrifax, but in general, you need that rend just across the board when fighting Bone Reapers. It's also kind of very useful against Fire Slayers, an army that can match you in aggression and potential speed. Now, the thing with Morathi, though, is she's not our general because we don't need her command trait. And because her secondary function, beyond being a magic engine for Mind Razor, is to transform her and throw her into something that we want to distract. We don't want to deal with that unit of 20 Hearthguard that the opponent has brought, or with those huge blob of Ossiarch Mortek Guard, or whatever other deadly unit that the enemy has brought. For example, maybe a Terrorgeist if you're playing against Flesh Eater Courts. And you've just decided, alright, we're going to transform Morathi and we're going to throw her into that unit. And that is her main primary function outside of delivering the Mind Razor. Now, she stops being as good at getting the Mind Razor off, but she can still keep attempting it, which is good. She doesn't lose her ability to cast, she just goes down to being only able to cast 1 and unbind 1, and you're always going to be using that on Mind Razor, and she no longer gets the bonuses once she's transformed. But in exchange, you do get a far more beefy beat stick of a unit. And since her special rule for the Iron Heart of Cain is essentially what's going to be making up her value here and keeping her away. She's very good positionally in her snake form for blocking and denying enemy movement, forcing them to fall back and try and go around her, using the 3-inch engagement range of keeping out that you can't move into to kind of keep enemies at bay. Especially with that semi-large base of her, it's pretty reasonable to be able to do that. And so she's an excellent control tool, ironically. But even when she gets stuck into that combat and is tying up those enemy units, she can still potentially deliver a lot of particularly good attacks. Her Gaze of Morathi is pretty good, her Heart Rend is very good, and she of course has a couple of other bits and bobs for attacks like her Envenomed Tail and a Crown of Serpents, and she essentially just becomes the nearest equivalent you have to a big beefy monster, and at the same time, she also doesn't have the weaknesses that most monsters have, where they will normally just go down to a lot of attacks, thanks to that Iron Heart of Cain. The next thing we've got in this list, which is our general, is our Cauldron of Blood, our Hag Queen on Cauldron of Blood for 300 points. And now, it wouldn't be a Daughters of Cain list without a Cauldron of Blood. These things are mandatory. If you're fighting against Daughters of Cain, the first thing you should take out is the Cauldron of Blood, and any other Hag Queens, or anything that has... any other Hag Queens. And that is because of their Witch Brew ability. But the Hag Queen on Cauldron of Blood is even more of a juicy target, and even more of a linchpin for Daughters of Cain, because of the buffs it gives. The Blood Shield, giving you the ways of improving your saving throws for Daughters of Cain units nearby in a rather large radius of 18 inches, is very good for making you that much more tanky. And now it is possible with the right build and the right equipment to stack that up so that in combat you are rocking 4-up saves. And you can do a number of things to really make the most out of the Hag Queen on the Cauldron of Blood. So because of how important this Cauldron of Blood is, and as we've decided to make it our general in this list. Now, doing so will allow us to protect it that much more, because we've given it Terrifying Beauty as its trait, which will help protect it both in melee and in against shooting attacks, where it's most vulnerable, because it, well, it will get Lookout, Sir. It will get Lookout, Sir, which is an excellent thing about it. Just had to look at my keywords there. Because the last time I played against it, we discussed that, and forgot it had Lookout, Sir, which would have protected against the shooting. Still lost that game anyway. And when I last used it, I also pretty sure I forgot about it when I was playing the Daughters of Cain. So, it's a very important unit. So using Terrifying Beauty to help keep it alive as a linchpin that does a lot for our army is worth it over any other command abilities that Morathi is going to give us. Now, in addition to that, the Cauldron of Blood, it's giving us a shield for increasing our durability. It's giving us the Witch Brew, which we are immediately going to use first things first every hero phase. And we're going to use it straight on our witches, or our Sisters of Slaughter. And it's also got the prayers. And now, the prayers, the most important one is the Blessing of Cain. And this is the prayer that you want first. This is the prayer that you want. The Blessing of Cain, you pick a friendly Daughters of Cain unit within 14 inches, and until the start of your next hero phase, you are re-rolling your Fanatical Faith, which is your 6-up to ignore damage. So, this thing really holds your army together. On top of that, it gives +1 bravery. The friendly Daughters of Cain within 7 inches. So, it is a be-all, end-all of buffing units for your army, and it's very important. And now, the thing about it is you always want this unit to be moving behind the blob of Witch Elves that we've included in this army. Now, this is a fairly standard tactic for Daughters of Cain. You'll see it all the time. And for those of you who fought Daughters of Cain or already played Daughters of Cain, you'll understand that's a pretty basic concept. This thing lingers just behind the Witch Elf blob, just to be able to give its buffs and be able to get into position to give its buffs next turn without too much of a hassle. It can contribute in combat. However, another reason why we've given it Terrifying Beauty is because it doesn't become really good in combat with the Avatar of Cain on board, it being awakened, until it reaches Battle Round 3. At Battle Round 3, you can feel free to throw this thing into combat, and it should do pretty well, with the Avatar of Cain's sword being fairly fantastic, giving it 4 extra attacks that are 3s and 3s, -2, 3 damage. The rest of its attacks are pretty good, as said, but it is a very important unit that you don't want to overcommit too early. Then, we've got a Bloodrack Medusa in the list. Now, this is just an additional wizard to help get us some extra spells that we particularly want, as well as dish out some mortal wounds against things that are particularly resilient, things that, for example, might have ethereal, large units with 3-up saves, and so on and so forth. Here, it also has the privilege in this list of being a delivery method for one of our most important spells in this entire list. We've given it one of our artifacts, the Rune of Ulgu. The other artifact is the mandatory one that comes from being Driachi Ganeth, that we've given to the only model that's eligible to have it in our list, which we'll get to in a moment. The Bloodrack Medusa uses the Rune of Ulgu to know an additional spell, letting it go for Steed of Shadows in case you desperately need to move it around the board, increasing its movement, and using the Bloodrack Stare to really, to its fullest. Or, the more important spell, the Withering, which is harder to cast, but definitely one of the most important and best utility spells you have, because you hit well now with Driachi Ganeth. You go from hitting on 3s to 2s, but you're still wounding on 4s most of the places, especially with Witch Elves. So, the Withering will give you +1 to wound against a chosen target within 18 inches of the caster. So, it's very good for making you that much more killy, especially when you combine that with Witch Brew for re-rolling, and essentially, the Bloodrack Medusa is there solely for the purposes of being a more mobile spellcaster with some mortal wounds output, and mostly throwing on the Withering for those extra spells, because the spells that you have are good, and there are a couple of particularly essential ones, like Mind Razor and Withering, which are staples that we've included in this list because they're just very, very good for your army. And on top of that, the Bloodrack Medusa is really cheap at 140 points compared to your other heroes that we've taken here. Now, we go on to the crux of the list. Now, the rest of the list is a Slaughter Troop Battalion, and it makes up the entire rest of our army, and this is where the cycle charging comes in. Because the Slaughter Troop gives the ability that all units within the Slaughter Troop can retreat and still shoot and charge in the same turn. So this will allow you, with the units within the Slaughter Troop, whether that be the Witch Elves, the Cavalry, or the Sisters of Slaughter, to charge in one round, get your +1 to hit, and should you get the double turn, be able to immediately pull out, and then charge straight back in to get your +1 to hit again. So this is an army that, if you get the double turn, can be especially killy. So that is the case, and there are cases where if your opponent is foolish enough to stay in combat with you, you can just fall back and cycle charge straight back in. So it is very much using and abusing the Driachi Ganeth rule with this ability. So, the next thing we've got is the good old... Now, the rest of this is made up of 2 Cavalry units, 2 Sisters of Slaughter units, 1 Slaughter Queen, and 1 Witch Elf unit. So, going through this, the Slaughter Queen is mandatory, and we've given the Slaughter Queen the Dark Sword from Driachi Ganeth, because we have to. It has to be the first relic we take, and all it really does is slightly increase the attack capabilities of our Slaughter Queen. The Slaughter Queen herself is not particularly scary as a character, but she can now do some work with that, and, you know, she can potentially duel an opposing character down, but it really depends on the character. She's best at assassinating squishier characters, but her most important thing is keeping up with the rest of the units in this battalion, namely the Witch Elves, and using Catechism of Murder, which will allow them to score 2 hits, which will allow the target unit of the prayer to score 2 hits for each roll of a 6. So, a very important prayer, and so you've probably figured out by now that the whole point of each of these characters, the Slaughter Queen with Catechism of Murder, Marathi with Mind Razor, the Cauldron of Blood with Witch Brew, Idol, and Blood Shield, and with the Blessing of Cain, and the Bloodrack Medusa with the Withering are all designed to buff up a single unit in your army, and that is the Witch Elves. And that's what we're going to talk about next. The Witch Elves that we've taken for one of our battle line, our other two battle line, are also in this battalion. They're the 2 units of Sisters of Slaughter. And so all of those characters are designed to increase the efficiency and abilities of the Witch Elves. So, the Witch Elves are essentially going to be running and charging forward thanks to their horn blowers in the first turn that you've got, if they can reliably get within a solid charge range, and you're going to be running every one of your characters after they've cast their prayers and spells during the movement phase in an attempt to keep up, so that you can keep someone nearby to get a re-roll with your CP on that charge. This is a good way to pull off a first turn charge, especially depending on your deployment zone and the kind of terrain that's littering the center of the battlefield. So every one of these units is designed to increase the efficiency of this large 300-point, 30-woman Witch Elf unit. And now, here with this Witch Elf unit, we've gone for the paired sacrificial knives, so we've given up having a little bit more defense in exchange for having a little bit more attack power. So the paired... Yeah, so that's what we've gone with. Now, the unit itself is pretty much just that's it. We've gone for extra attacks, 3 attacks instead of 2, 3s and 4s on them. And that is why we need to buff them up immensely. And once buffed up, they can deliver a lot of attacks. On top of that, they gain extra attacks being nearby a friendly Daughters of Cain hero, which is another reason why the Slaughter Queen and the Cauldron of Blood are going to be nearby this unit in order to make them 4 attacks apiece. Potentially hitting on 2s, re-rolling 3s to wound with -1 rend, and maybe even 2 damage depending on the bravery of your opponent. So that in itself is a super huge Death Star, and that's the whole point. Cycle charge that. And now, the rest of this list is all designed to, while the Witch Elf and all those characters work together to pummel your opponent into the ground, the rest of your army is actually designed for this list to play the competitive game with taking objectives. And yes, they can get very deadly in combat because they are still Daughters of Cain. But the idea is to, while this is going on as a massive Death Star, for lack of a better term, massive killy horde that is designed to just punch through and slaughter your opponent's army, the rest of your army works on controlling the battlefield. The 2 Sisters of Slaughter units act to cut off your enemy's mobility. The 2 units of 10 advancing on either flank of the Witch Elves have a 6-inch pilot and engagement range, which means your opponent has to be really careful when they move in. They can draw your Sisters of Slaughter units in, and that's just free attacks, potentially, that those Sisters of Slaughters are just going to get on your unit, or on the opponent unit. And they can really be used to hem in units, and prevent the opponent from moving around the battlefield a lot, forcing him to either engage them or bypass them. Either way, they work as excellent speed blocks until you can get through them. Now, here we've got a unit with bladed bucklers and we've got a unit with sacrificial knives. If we wanted to be more efficient, we'd give them both bladed bucklers to serve better as those distractions and those roadblocks to help control the opponent's movements. But the sacrificial knives just helps increase that one unit's killing potential just a little bit, but not to a point that's really noticeable overall, depending on what you're fighting. Now, the rest of the list is another interesting. We've gone for 2 Cavalry units, 1 unit of 10, which is essentially where your ranged firepower is going to be. And now this is a unit that can deep strike down, shoot at stuff, skirmish away, take objectives very quickly with their fast move, and really play the competitive game. And then we've got another unit of 5, because that's what we could afford after the battalion, just to do the same thing. The unit of 5, again, skirmishing, but it's going to be more relegated to the objective grabbing. And while their javelins are particularly good, being 3s and 3s at 12 inches with -1 damage, 5 shots of those, that's pretty good. The thing is that, they're great, and they go up to -2 the turn they come down. Which means they're actually particularly good at chewing through monsters and things with 4-up saves, and characters too, if you can get that assassinate on, because they go up to 4-ups to hit, or if you can get someone just out of position. They kind of just use their movement of being particularly good to run around the battlefield with 14 inches and their skirmishing fire, and they're the objective takers of this army. Now, this army is pretty simplistic. It is meant to take and be simplistic, however, it is very synergistic focused, with the Daughters of Cain being that super synergy-based army. What you do is very much a case of all your eggs into one basket, and that basket goes forward and kills anything in its path. And then the other things that, your support characters, they also contribute to doing that as well, while the rest of your units focus on controlling the battlefield, scoring your objectives, assassinating things that try to go through, or acting as speed bumps to prevent your opponent from getting out of the way of those units. Now, that's not always going to go to plan. You might be fighting an army with exceptional mobility, like the Carriage-on Overlords, in which case you need to be exceptionally careful about your positioning, and in that case, the Sisters of Slaughter become your screens to help keep units, mobile units away from your very important characters until those Witch Elves can eventually find and reach their target. Now, when it comes to fighting high mobility armies, the trick is to get aggressive very quickly to cut that mobility off of the legs. If they can't move around the board, it's going to be trouble. The trick is when you fight armies that, particularly, there are two kinds of armies that go very well against Daughters of Cain. The first is people who can deep strike around the board, and this is because it can be really hard to hem them in with this fewer models, and respond effectively to their sudden deployment of powerful troops across the other side of the battlefield. Now, fortunately, you have the speed to deal with that. It's just, depending on how far away it is, you might have to put in a lot more effort. You can get overcommitted to one side, which is something you have to be very careful about, depending on where you're going for your Witch Elves to be situated. Situate them on one flank too hard, and they might kill everything on that flank, but they will never get to the opponent's rest of his army if he's playing a particularly mobile army and just skirting you, which he probably will. Now, that being said, the fact that Age of Sigmar is an objective-based game is always going to work in your favor, because so long as you are sitting on those objectives, or your opponent has to sit on those objectives, it means that you know where he's going to be, so you can plan out the movement of where you need to go, where you need to be positioned in order to do the running and charging and being able to move up and kill the things that you need to kill. And now this very much is an army of kill, kill, kill. Now the second army that this kind of thing struggles against are particularly steam-rolling armies. Now, the classic example of a steam-rolling army is something like the Ogres. They're fast when they need to be fast, and they just keep coming forward. And the moment they reach you, they either pummel you, or you get stuck on them. Because they're durable enough to be taking your hits, and while you can throw a lot of stuff at them, they will essentially keep throwing stuff at you. And if they break through you, and they flatten you, and keep going, they'll break your army. And that is something that I've seen happen, and it can happen particularly bad against Ogres. As a very particular example, they are a good counter to Daughters of Cain, because they have a high number of wounds, they're fast, and they don't care about holding back, and they can be tanky and aggressive. So, that's really it for this list. It's a very simple list at its core that relies upon just abusing the basic mechanics of the game, such as double turns, and to really make the most out of a single trait, to be as aggressive as possible. And so you combine that aggression with some control factors, and boom, you get a very competitive list that, while it can deal with all comers potentially, will struggle against a few things here and there, but will most of the time perform very well. Against units that have other Death Stars, it'll come up to a matchup of what your Witch Elves can take on, depending on the circumstances, and depending on how well you're able to get your buffs off. If you're not able to get any of your buffs off, your army will struggle to a lesser extent, but your base units are still very good, and you have that controlling and speed factor that you can really use to help make up for any such mistakes. Once again, this is an army where positioning is key, and you're going to have to be paying attention to that. Morathi helps serve as a controlling unit as well, which can help you get around some of those units that you particularly don't like. For example, Morathi is a good way of dealing with, once again, those steamrolling ogres who will come up to you very quickly. They'll either all die or not care about any damage you do, and as a result, they'll just pummel you to death with multiple damage, which means you'll be taking a lot of fanatical faith saves, and you don't have much armor, so they can rip through you, especially with their Iron Guts, a particularly nasty unit. And the same with their Beast Claw Raider units, which you excel at actually taking down if you can get your Witch Elves to surround it with your sheer number of attacks, but the Stonehorn is still a deadly foe that fighting multiples of, and fighting them in tandem, can be a real challenge for any army, no matter how killer you are. And depending on how lucky your opponent gets with their rolls to ignore damage. It used to be a lot worse, and you used to be a really good counter to them. Now, Stonehorns are much more killy, you could say, but they will go down much faster, which is good for you, but also they can field multiples of them, so just be aware of that. But Morathi is an excellent counter to those very aggressive units that want to counter your aggression with other high damage aggression, because you just throw Morathi at them, and she just can't take any more than 3 damage. So they're multi-damage attacks from that Terrorgeist, from those Ogre Iron Guts, from that big blob of Hearthguard Berserkers. All of a sudden, that's a lot of attacks that are being wasted, forcing them to retreat and reposition, and giving you more time to send your Witch Elves into other units that you know you can kill in a single shot, or at least force them into a position where that unit is effectively neutered. And then, as the battle progresses, you do get stronger, which will allow you to take care of those stragglers even more, so it'll let you build up your power to do that, because you can take advantage of your Blood Rights table to get those rerolls, and those Blood Rights table, again, also, which is not something we mentioned thus far, but it is a very obvious buff that this army does take into account in using its the Blood Right at the appropriate time, and it's something you need to be aware of, because depending on when you're charging and when you're using certain units, such as the Cauldron of Blood, you need to make sure that the Blood Rights is at the appropriate level that you need to be able to pull your thing off. The Blood Rights mostly serve to make your army more reliable, but they do so as time goes on, which is good for you, because as time goes on and you take casualties, your army will become less reliable. So every little bit to increase that and counteract the casualties by increasing the efficiency of what units remain definitely works in your favor, especially compared to other armies that they just run out of steam as time goes on, and as casualties go on, they get less powerful and they don't have ways of counteracting that. You're an army that can increase your efficiency as the battle goes on to help mitigate your somewhat fragile nature. Now, things you can do to this list that can help improve it. Now, a couple of things you could do with this list is you could drop some units like like Morathi. Morathi is 480 points that you're investing for a very good magic delivery system during the first turn, and then later turns when you need her to be a very good blocking unit. However, she is 480 points, and with those 480 points, you could actually purchase, for 300 points, a second unit of 30-man Witch Elves. So that's double the number, and it gives you 60 Witch Elves. It gives you... Now, they won't be in the Slaughter Troop, unfortunately, but it's still another reserve unit in case your first unit gets killed or massacred or wiped out or gets stuck in combat. You can put your buffs onto the other unit and send them into something as well. That's a very obvious one. You could take a Marathi out and put in some Doomfire Warlocks for even more magic power, for some powerful Mortal Wounds output at a slightly longer range compared to the Bloodrack Medusa. You could take Marathi out and put in a Bloodrack Shrine for a huge Mortal Wounds battery that is still giving you good magic potential. But you lose those blocking abilities, as I said. But you're still not losing out on the magic, and you're getting more Mortal Wounds output, which is always good. Another thing, you could reduce the number of Khaine down to 2 units of 5. You could take some Blood Sisters or Blood Stalkers to act as bodyguards for your characters, particularly the Cauldron, your Hag, and your Bloodrack. And so there's some options you can do. If you wanted to increase the overall durability at the cost of some slight damage output, you could swap out the paired sacrificial knives for the bladed bucklers. Now, the bladed bucklers is that, they give you an extra, they make you save 5+, which is good, and then each time you make a save roll of a 6, the enemy unit you're in combat with suffers 1 mortal wound, so you get rewarded for saving your guys, and it just increases your durability, because you can get that up to a 4-up, which, on your Witch Elves, if you've got your Bloodrack, your Cauldron of Blood, in range. So, you could hone in your aggression, and make up for it with the sheer efficiency of your attacks that you can get through your combined stacked buffs, in exchange for lasting longer in combat. So, there is that. Now, that's a couple of just ideas. And now, if you're fighting against Daughters of Cain list, the counters to this is particularly simple. Deploy back and make sure that they can't get to you first turn. If you have to play aggressive, play aggressive. If you've got an army that you have a lot of wounds per model and you've got a lot of high damage, like ogres, and you've got a lot of durability, just march forward. They'll probably hack through 1 or 2 of your units, but you only need a few units to really deliver the damage back to them. Eliminating their characters is top priority, and anything that can mitigate their wound rolls is actually particularly good. Things that can counter the withering to, give things. They look like they might be hard to master, but this list is really just all about positioning, getting your buffs off, and getting into there with just calculating your movement right, and then just killing everything, and then abusing your rules to cycle charge in there, as if you were doing a cavalry cycle charge over and over again, but with infantry. And then using your faster units to control the board and nab those objectives. Okay, so this has been Jay from Jade Productions, doing a breakdown for a competitive Daughters of Cain list, which is essentially infantry cav. I will see you next time. Happy wargaming. If you would like more examples of lists for the Daughters of Cain, make sure to leave them in the comment below. And we'll see what we can put together and have some nice discussions about Age of Sigmar. So, I will see you next time.